Welcome back to Epic Exchanges. This week, I am super excited to have a longtime friend with me, Markku Kostamo, here to share his story. Thank you for being here, Markku. Super excited to have you share what's been going on with you and all the things you've learned over the last few years about yourself. And why don't you tell our audience a little bit about you?
Thanks, Kelly. Great to see you after quite a few years. I think COVID got in the way.
It did.
But it's good to be here with you. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So I'm based in South Surrey, close to White Rock at Kingfisher Farm. I'm married to Leah. I have two kids, Mo and Bryn. They're over in Victoria University and trade school. And I also live with bipolar 1 disorder. And this is a pretty recent diagnosis 6 years ago. I've served as an executive director in the nonprofit sector and a development director. And I also run my own business. So I'm bivocational right now. I run my own business helping charities grow and scale. And I also work as the development director for Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries.
You are busy.
I am, but I'm having lots of fun.
Good. And I can't believe your kids are in university, like in post-secondary.
It's so great. They're loving it. Although Mo has decided to move for now, from university to trade school. And that's fun. She wants to be a carpenter, or they want to be a carpenter.
Nothing wrong with trade school because
Great.
Always work. Right.
Lots of work.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm super excited, as I've said at least twice already, to have you share your story. So I'm just going to pass you the floor and let you dive in.
Great. Thank you. Well, as I said right off the bat, I live with bipolar 1 disorder. And there aren't really hints in life. I wish I wish there was a test that someone could just give you and tell you have bipolar disorder. But over the years, as I look back, there's some significant events in my life. Bipolar disorder is usually a combo of genetics, environmental factors, and trauma potentially. And so as a 6-year-old, I was sent to boarding school. My parents lived and worked in Nepal. And my experience, even though it was short, has shaped my whole life. 6 months in boarding school felt like abandonment to the sensitive kid I was. So I wouldn't even go sleep at a friend's house. So you can just imagine that kid going to boarding school. And that just felt like deep, deep betrayal and abandonment. I didn't know that, but over 40 years, I came to realize that this is what I feel all the time. I feel that big, huge abandonment button getting pushed. So that's one part of the journey. The other part of the journey is that I experienced depression. And I imagine that as a 6-year-old being in boarding school, I was actually depressed. And that depression, even as an 8-year-old, I would think about that and have suicidal thoughts as an 8-year-old. And I was telling my parents that, hey, this part isn't normal. It's not normal to have suicidal thoughts as an 8-year-old. That there must have been something going on linked to that abandonment piece. In my late teens, I was really active, so I didn't really experience a lot of depression. But in my 20s, I started to experience depression regularly. And it seemed like a cycle. And then into my 30s, I recognized I had this cycle of depression and then amazing activity, and I would get so much done. It was like I was an entrepreneur on steroids. And I would get so many kudos. People would pat me on the back. You're an amazing leader. You're such a good worker. You get so much done. You work twice as hard as anybody else. So it was this cycle through the year of getting so much done, and then getting a normal amount done, but being in the pit of darkness and depression. That finally culminated when that became a manic episode. And mania is can be scary and confusing for people around you. And for me, I think the kind of emotions I felt during, while I didn't know I was in a manic episode, but I felt a lot of anger, confusion, feeling misunderstood. And I didn't know, but there's a group of people, including my wife, Leah, and friends and a mentor that were tracking and just really concerned for me, concerned for Leah. And finally, after a few weeks of this erratic behavior of feeling so high, for example, I went and bought this really like a $4,000 canoe, and I came home. No conversation with Leah, just came home with a $4,000 canoe, and I was ecstatic. Look at this great canoe I bought. And Leah's like, oh, like that's $4,000. We didn't talk about that. So I was not really grounded. My feet weren't in reality. And that's common in mania to spend a lot of money, to be really on the high end of things, and emotionally extreme, purchases extreme, really impulsive. And then this mentor of mine on my 48th birthday and friends gathered, and I was invited into the living room of our house. And like right then, I knew something was up. This is an intervention, isn't it? And I was like deathly scared of having a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Just the stigma of it just really scared me. Like I did not want to have a mental illness. I was fine with depression, but something bigger really scared me. But I went willingly to the hospital. And after 3 days on the psych ward, where I kept thinking, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. This is not me. But I would have these conversations and hear other people's stories of why they were there or why they thought they were there. And then the penny dropped. It's like, I think, oh, I am one of these. This is my community right now. I actually do belong here. I can hear what they're saying, and it's not really making sense. Like there's something wrong. And that's what I sound like to other people. At that moment, I was still high as far as emotionally. But that moment really, I could just remember that moment of acceptance. And it's from that moment of like, 6 years out now, that was a moment of change starting. The moment of change was accepting that I have bipolar 1 disorder, and then learning to live with it. And it was that moment of acceptance. I mean, there's a lot of regret, a lot of tears, a lot of emotions, of feelings of sadness, of the kind of impact that I had on my family and friends and others through the symptoms of bipolar 1 disorder. So, for example, if you think about walking on a bus with a big backpack, there's the animated person walking along and just talking to everybody and not seeing this backpack hitting the people behind you. And that's what somebody who lives with bipolar 1 disorder that's undiagnosed can have. There's this people in my wake are significantly impacted, and I might not know. And that's one of the deepest regrets that I have. And so a lot of my work has been this ongoing journey of making amends and reconciling, and really trying to understand the kind of impact that I've had. So, but that moment of acceptance on the psych ward was the beginning of transformation and a journey towards recovery. So now I live openly with bipolar 1 disorder. I have lifestyle changes that I've made. I'm on medication. I make sure I sleep really well. And I also chart my moods every day. And I ask people to reflect back. What's your experience of me right now? For that self-awareness. And I think I'm living a much more stable life, and I feel much more grounded.
It's amazing to see this, to hear your journey from perhaps not being so aware to this, knowing yourself so much. And I don't want to even use the word self-aware, but knowing yourself and your journey so much that you have asked other people to take part in helping you maybe recognize some red flags before things get out of hand again. And I could be wrong, but that's just what I'm getting from your story. But thank you so much for sharing this, for being vulnerable and honest and letting people in, because that's the important part of our stories. So thank you.
You're welcome. My privilege.
If you don't mind, I have some questions. I was like furiously writing notes, and as I wrote them, sometimes you were answering them even as I was writing the questions. So I apologize if there's any replication in what you said. But so when you talked about the intervention that you had from friends on your birthday, walking in, knowing it was an intervention, and you said you were deathly scared that it sounded like you already had an idea that there was something going on, that you had an issue. Had you clarified that for yourself, or was it just the fact that there's a room full of people who care about you? And, you know, we all know the what typically an intervention might look like. And and it's not a surprise party, it's different, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so interesting. Like for years before then, I could not watch a movie like a psychological thriller or anything that had psychosis or like psychological, somebody on a psych ward. Like I couldn't watch those movies. And it might have been a subconscious, like, oh, that's hitting too close to home. I mean, I don't watch horror movies, but I had the same feeling about psychological movies. Like, and so I think there was something subconscious deep within me that was so scared and fearful of what is in the unknown. Well, like it's like don't get too close to the edge of that cliff, because you're going to fall into this dark place that is despair and darkness. And so that's one side. The other side is stigma. So and for me in particular, like I remember saying to Leah, like, oh, I think I must have PTSD. I can't have a bipolar disorder, because that means I need to go on lithium. And that would be so bad. It's like, what was so bad about that? Actually, I am on lithium and it's great. It's really stabilizing. So nothing wrong about it. It's kind of like, I'm like an electric car. I run on lithium batteries. Yeah. So it's, I think that moment was really about not wanting to be diagnosed because of a stigma, stigma that I was afraid that I would experience from others, but stigma that I was also now realize that was self-stigma. I was stigmatizing myself. Like I was creating this stigma around a mental illness diagnosis. And so I think probably that's, in hindsight, I think that's what was happening. In the moment, like there's just this dawning, like, felt like the lamb being led to the slaughter. Like, like my heart dropped to my stomach. I just had this pit in my, like, this deep, dark pit in my stomach. And I just sat there and, hey, what's going on? This is an intervention, right? Yes. So I went to the hospital willingly at that point. It wasn't, but my mentor said to me later, I knew you were really unwell. when we're driving, because you kept talking and making jokes. Everybody else was quiet and like, this was serious. This was sad. But I wasn't present. Like I was in that way. I was present as someone whose feet weren't on the ground. Thanks
Right.
for that question.
Almost disassociating what was happening from you. And
Yeah. I mean, I think as mania, with bipolar disorder, we have hypomania, which is still significant, but it's not, maybe you're still more connected to who you are. In mania, you're become less and less connected to reality. So it is a kind of dissociation for sure, but it's more than that.
okay. So one of my questions, and I'd love to dive a little bit into the stigma attached to any mental health diagnosis, any illness, really, there's so much in our society that we have these stigmas, whether we've attached them personally because it's something we're afraid of or we don't understand or we have judgments about, or society as a whole has kind of like kept them as things we don't talk about, things we don't acknowledge. So I would love to know how and where you kind of came to the point of not only accepting your diagnosis, because you did explain that when you were sharing your story, but where and how did you decide that it was time for you personally to kind of take on that public stigma attached to mental health issues and to stand up and say, this is who I am and this is what I struggle with?
Yeah, I think it's just living my experience post. It's messy, that post diagnosis and post mania, and because you weren't yourself, but you did and said a lot of things that were hurtful. So you have to kind of take responsibility for that and pull that apart from what is stigma. So I think it probably took me about 3 years to get to a place where I can kind of feel like I can start to talk about this and be an advocate, and to kind of understand and be on a journey to recovery. It's often said that it takes 3 to 5 years since you've been diagnosed to be into recovery in a mental health journey. And of course, mental health is you have that for life, so it doesn't go away, but you learn to live with it and manage it and flourish with it and to live in recovery. So I think there needs to be enough self-awareness. And I think about 3 years in, I felt like I'm now self-aware enough. I mean, I'm still learning every day. I'm still learning more, and growing. So that doesn't change, but I think you need to have enough self-awareness to be able to pull apart your own issues and how you contribute to the stigma and what others contribute to the stigma. So, now I realize as well, that I contribute to my own stigma that I experience. And I also know, and I am sensitive to when I'm experiencing that from others or from society. And often that's language, it's unintentional. Yeah. So, for example, someone might unintentionally say, you're acting crazy, or you are crazy, or you are manic, or you are bipolar. I gently push back into that and say, actually, I'm none of those. I'm Markku, and I live with bipolar disorder. So a lot of it has to do with language and being careful about language and kind of the assumptions that come with the way things are said.
Yeah, I have experienced that in my own journey in terms of language around eating disorders. And I'm quoting that for those on the podcast that can't see me air quoting eating disorders, I prefer to use a disordered eating pattern because a pattern can be changed and managed instead of it becoming part of our identity and who we are,
Yeah.
because it's not who we are. It's
Yeah,
something we live with.
exactly.
So
Totally. Yeah.
I appreciate that language shift too, and you bringing attention to that. I'd love to dive into kind of the impact and the making amends part. What does that look like for you on a maybe daily basis? But my assumption would be that in the early days, there was a lot more making amends than you are doing now. But does that still come up now?
It does still come up. It comes up. I mean, I still have moments where, like, let's say I'm working really hard and I'm probably like, I mean, I still experience depression and hypomania. So it's not a flat line. I don't live on a flat line, but the medication, lifestyle, and other interventions I do help me take off the tops and the bottoms of the valleys. So it flattens it out. So when I'm hypomanic, I can still be a little more assertive. I can be, be more emotional. I can be more aggressive in my language. So when I see that happening, I just have to dial it back and hold it, like do the opposite thing, like go and be alone, go for a nice quiet walk, do calming things. And then in the times when I'm feeling some depression, again, I can naturally withdraw, not return phone calls, not return texts. So at both ends of those, there's amends making, even today, like, oh, I'm sorry I didn't get back to you. Or I'm sorry I spoke harshly with you yesterday. So that's an ongoing thing. But from the bigger moments of being manic, being suicidal, being in those phases, times when I was undiagnosed, and the biggest impact was on family, on Leah and Mo and Bryn. That's an ongoing amends making that probably has no end. What I mean that is that the relationships continue to form and shape, and the more vulnerable we can be, and because we all realize the impact of that over time. So, and as time goes on, as we all do our work in therapy, more things come up, and then there's more amends making and reconciliation that needs to happen. So I don't think that ever ends, Kelly. Like, I think that's not to reflect like a bad relationship, but it means that there's been hurt and trauma on kids, in both directions, and amends making. And then friendships, that's interesting. Like, and if you are a friend of someone who has a significant mental illness, there are two things to do. I think one is to care and love, but also to care for yourself. So I have had friends who took a year off during that hardest time. They were hurt. They couldn't be with me. And that was the best thing for them, to take a year off. And we've reconnected, and we're dear friends. And I understand why they needed to take that year off. They understand now what happened. But in the midst of those really crunchy, hard times, it was really confusing for everybody. Like, why is Markku acting like this? Or why is he saying those hurtful things? Or so it's time, and it's that faithfulness of time. And then there are some people who you make amends with, but really that's kind of, there's no closeness, and that's just understandable. So
And I would venture to say it's the nature of all relationships. And a lot of, I believe what you had to say, we can all take to heart, whether we struggle with mental health issues or not. I mean, I believe that we all do to some extent, but perhaps not to such a strong extent where we need medication to manage or all the other pieces. But we're all constantly hurting people because we have hurt places. And when we can recognize those places and make amends, make the relationship better, or even if we need space from a friendship, from a relationship, recognize that, take the space we need, and no hard feelings. And I think that's the hardest part, because I imagine there's probably some abandonment issues that might have come up for you when those friends stepped away if you didn't understand it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was the overlaying issue as well. And that's been a lot of hard work, just pressing into that abandonment and growing and allowing that 6-year-old boy to heal. So there's been beyond the bipolar and managing bipolar 1 disorder, that abandonment wound, that's been a lot. I've done a lot of work around that, and through therapy, and there's been a lot of healing that's happened there, which, with bipolar 1 disorder, emotional dysregulation is an issue, but with abandonment, emotional dysregulation, the abandonment trauma, that's an issue, emotional dysregulation. So not being able to, to live within a window of tolerance that is normal. It's, we can't, when we're dysregulating like that, it's not, essentially it's different than what other people are experiencing.
Yeah.
So coming to a place of learning to work with that has been very significant and healing as well.
Well, I commend you for doing the hard work, because it is hard. It's definitely not easy. Emotional highs and lows, and it takes real commitment to doing the work. If there was one thing that someone could take away from hearing your story and your journey, what would you like that to be?
That there's hope for anyone struggling with mental health or living with mental health challenges, whether you have an illness or not. There is hope. There's hope in friendships. There's hope in time, and there's hope in that this too will pass, especially if you can be intentional about reaching out to people, doing things that bring health, and pressing into that, and also disregarding the people or the circumstances that maybe try to push you down, sort of trying to create space from those places, whether it's a circumstance or a substance or people sometimes.
I imagine that our conversation here might have piqued more questions, or perhaps people wanting to find some help or even connect with you. How can they do that?
Well, one easy place is LinkedIn. You can just find me at Markku _ Kostamo at LinkedIn. My website for my business is KACI.io. And then I'm also at Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries.org or sanctuarymentalhealth.org.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure to link all of those in the show notes on the audio podcast and down in the description underneath this video here on YouTube. So please, if anything sparked anything in you, please reach out to Markku. You're more than generous with your time and your story, and I really appreciate that. One final question, just kind of for fun. If there was to be a book or a movie written about you and your life, what do you think it would be called?
The Starry Night. I love Van Gogh's paintings, and that Starry Night is just this, I don't know, it's just experience that says a lot. That painting says a lot. this village. I mean, he painted it from the psych ward looking out, imagining this village in this landscape, and then just the amazing kind of starry, like almost like a mania happening in the sky, and the depression happening. So and then just his own story. He likely lived with bipolar 1 disorder. So yeah, so The Starry Night.
I love that because it not only has it resonated with you, but it also shows how other people's stories, how we can connect with them, because you've obviously connected with Van Gogh's story in such
Yes.
a way that that piece of art, the story behind it, has become super meaningful to you. And that just goes to show the power of all of our stories, whether we are still living or not. So
Yeah,
thank you
so
so
true.
much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your story. And I'm so happy to have reconnected with you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having me. It's been really fun. Thank you.